Welcome to the Irish Revolution. Last month, April 1919, we talked about the second and third meeting of Dáil Éireann, where Éireann de Valera formally became the president of the Dáil. The Dáil also officially called for a boycott of the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police. We also spoke about the Limerick Soviet and an ambush in County Cork. This month's May 1919, we'll look at one of the biggest IRA operations to date, the so-called Rescue Knocklong, where members of the 3rd Tipperary and East Limerick Brigades stage a rescue of a captured IRA man. The first of the Dáil Courts are set up in County Mayo, and at the very end we'll talk a little bit about the Paris Peace Conference. In case you're worried, I don't think it's necessary to have seen the prior episodes to understand what is going on in this one. Sure, you already know the basics, don't you? There was a rebellion in 1916 and the separatist Sinn Fein party won a landslide in the 1918 election. Last month, the Dáil, the Revolutionary Parliament, had just ordered a boycott of the police and had formally set up a number of, quote, government departments, unquote. The IRA were only getting going really, but as we'll see this month, the Tipperary IRA were up to a few tricks and other units in other parts of Ireland were getting weapons and slowly and surely making preparations to fight. And oh yeah, in case I haven't said this already, please subscribe and like the video if you indeed liked it. And if you didn't, well, I'm sorry to hear that. So let us start with a few biographies today. Dan Breen, Austin Stack and Sean T. O'Kelly. So, Dan Breen was indicative of the revolutionary generation. Born in 1894, he would have been 25 at the outbreak of hostilities in January 1919. It was he, along with a few others, who ambushed a patrol of policemen and shot 2 of them at the Sulhead Beg ambush. This wasn't the first time the Volunteers, later known as the IRA, traded blows with the police, but is often seen as the first shots of the Irish War of Independence. He was a leading light in this month's Knocklong ambush, where he helped organise a daring rescue of his captured comrade Sean Hogan. After this incident, he decamped for Dublin, where he would take part in various ambushes and become part of Michael Collins's so-called squad. Austin Stack was the commandant of the Kerry Brigade around the time of the 1916 Rising. He failed to coordinate with Roger Caseman's attempt to land arms at Kerry. Kerry's subsequent inaction during the Easter Rising would go on to haunt him and cause him a lot of guilt. Stack would go on to be sentenced to death for his part in the Easter Rising, but like many others, his sentence was commuted and he was sent to prison instead. Later released under the general amnesty, he would be elected as Sinn Féin TD and become Minister for Home Affairs in the first Dáil, where he would create the Dáil Courts. The Dáil Courts were by far and away his most impressive legacy, and they played a huge part in legitimising the Dáil government, as the majority of people in Ireland went on to recognise these Republican courts at the same time as the British court system entered terminal decline. Sean T. O'Kelly was a founding member of the Sinn Féin party in 1905, meaning he was a member of the party when it was a tiny dual monarchist organisation, essentially a pressure group for advanced nationalist journalists and activists. He was elected to the Dublin Corporation in 1906. Unlike Arthur Griffiths, who we spoke about last month, O'Kelly was an active participant in the planning for the 1916 Easter Rising. He was elected a TD in the wave election in 1918 and became the Ceann Comhairle of the First Dáil, which is basically the position of Speaker in the Parliament or Congress. O'Kelly appointed himself as envoy to the Paris Peace Conference, where he failed to achieve anything and spent much of 1920 in Rome updating the Pope on the Irish situation. So let's start with the events in Knocklong, which is on the Tipperary-Limerick border. The Irish public often regards January 21st, 1919 to be the start of the Irish War of Independence. This was the opening of the Revolutionary Parliament in Dublin, Dáil Éireann. There was also, much more ominously, an attack on that day in Sulhead Beg in County Tipperary. Without any authorisation from the headquarters in Dublin, a local IRA unit consisting of Dan Breen, Sean Tracy and others attacked a police escort with gelignite and explosive. 2 policemen were killed. The attack would be indicative of future events, as it was entirely locally organised, with no input from Dublin. Indeed, it was roundly condemned by most prominent Republicans at the time. It was also a sign that many of the young men in the country were impatient with the politicians in Dublin and were preparing to take matters into their own hands and escalate the brewing conflict into a full-blown war. As a consequence of this attack, South Tipperary was declared a special military area, which is effectively a form of martial law. The IRA unit responsible for the attack were forced on the run, Sean Hogan was later captured, and his rescue on the 13th of May would again see 2 RIC men killed. While one could argue that such numbers are relatively small, the aggregate effect of attacks such as this and the shooting of resident magistrates, such as the one in March in County Mayo, would have had a big effect on public opinion. It is also ironic in a way because the Tipperary men were looking for a way to initiate another attack, but were unable to find any decent targets. The police, by arresting one of their number, offered an opportunity to stage something spectacular, which would then go on to enter into Republican folklore in years to come. The rescue took place in Knocklong, which Dan Breen in his memoir calls a wayside station, chosen because it was not a garrison town or would not have had a significant number of army or police. The IRA unit, which had assembled for the audacious mission, consisted of 8 men, 5 armed with revolvers, 3 armed with nothing. 4 men had boarded the train at the stop up the road at Emly in order to find out what carriage Hogan was in. Breen and his men had even set up a rudimentary intelligence system. Instructions would be sent to the station's coalmaster from Thurles using the word Greyhound as code. So the men knew that the prisoner had been delayed in Thurles. They would subsequently know the exact train on which the prisoner escort would be on. There was a level of sophistication here which does deserve some credit. This was a very well planned operation. By chance, a Dublin-bound train full of armed soldiers had left the station moments before the Hogan train arrived. The IRA men went into the compartment and located Hogan. He was under armed guard by 4 policemen. According to Dan Breen, and I really must stress, his memoir should be taken with a huge pinch of salt, a constable had his revolver pressed on Hogan's head and was apparently in the process of pulling the trigger before he was shot. Anyway, it's impossible to prove or disprove this claim a century on. Breen went on to describe what appeared to be utter pandemonium as IRA men struggled with the police in cramped quarters. A second policeman was shot after a dramatic wrestle between him and Sean Tracy, one of the 8 rescuers. As this was happening, one of the other policemen who had jumped out of the window had started firing random shots into the carriage. Dan Breen attempted to draw his fire away from the scuffle in the carriage by shooting at him with his revolver. Breen got shot in the lung and the arm. At one point the policeman lost his courage and made a run for it. In the subsequent inquest, it was a sign of things to come as the jury came out in favour of the IRA men and blamed the government for putting the police in danger. The British court system in Ireland would very soon be all but a fiction and would be rendered incapable of enforcing the law. As Dan Breen put it, quote, "This is a true story of the Knocklong rescue. After the affair, we were vehemently denounced as cold-blooded assassins. 2 years later, we're being hailed as heroes." Unquote. That quote, I feel, might well sum up the entire War of Independence. The historian Charles Townsend put it much more succinctly than I ever could when he wrote, quote, "If the direction of the Republican campaign was uncertain after Sulhead Beg, its momentum was restored by this operation and confirmed by its aftermath." Unquote. It's mad, really, how a relatively small group of men could have such an impact on the entire war. The Tipperary men made themselves scarce and went to Dublin, where they met Michael Collins. They were seen by some there as something of a nuisance. Michael Collins had even made arrangements to spirit them off to America. But Seamus Robinson, one of the lads, immediately refused, saying that they'd fight it out. Collins appeared happy enough for that. Okay, a look at the Dáil Courts now. Remember how I talked about the rebellious jury in the Knocklong case? British administration was in huge trouble, and this month it only got worse. The first so-called Dáil Court took place in Ballinrobe, County Mayo on the 17th of May. It adjudicated a dispute between 2 landowners who were being intimidated by smallholders claiming their land. Each had around 60 acres. The court found against the claimants, and they were advised to turn their attention against a 700-acre holding owned by the Congested District Boards of British Congo. The claimants refused to accept the court's decision and protested outside the building against it. The local volunteer IRA battalion were called in to arrest 4 of the claimants' leaders, who were then held prisoner on an island in Lough Corrib until they accepted the Dáil's authority. The local commander did not enjoy performing this order, but he followed his orders and an important precedent had been established. Austin Stack, the minister responsible, approached this innovation with great energy and went about devising a nationwide system of Dáil Courts. Arbitration courts, like the one in Ballinrobe, were technically legal as they did not oblige witnesses to attend. Stack envisioned a much broader system of courts, which would not have been legal in British eyes, whose decisions were to be enforced by a Republican police. On the 21st of May, he proposed a nationwide system of parish and district courts. Over the next year or so, these courts blossomed in every part of the country, with the exception of Unionist North Eastern Ireland. British courthouses were burnt down across the country, and the British legal system essentially ceased to function. It had been supplanted by this revolutionary legal system. If you're interested in this, you should have a look at a video I made about the Dáil Courts and how they operated, including a kind of case study from a native Monaghan. Right, a quick look here at the Dáil loan. So I talked briefly about the so-called Dáil loan last episode. Around $1 million had been raised in America by mid-1919 under a separate scheme, but very little of it actually made its way to Sinn Fein. Michael Collins, as finance minister, appointed in April 1919, could not perform the duties typical of finance ministers the world over: collecting taxes, spending money, greasing wheels. No, his task was much more basic. He needed to find money for an essentially imaginary state. The Dáil loan was an ingenious solution to this problem. It had its controversies when De Valera goes to America next month in June, particularly because it was effectively a bond, but a bond issued against an entity that had no real legal standing. But it worked, and worked remarkably well, and it was perhaps the single greatest political triumph of the Irish Republicans. Well, that's a big claim, isn't it? Also, since I don't know where else to mention this, Harry Boland goes to America this month and is replaced as president of the IRB, Irish Republican Brotherhood, by Michael Collins. So, the Paris Peace Conference. I talked a little bit about the Paris Peace Conference in earlier episodes, and it may not surprise you to learn that Republican diplomats there did not achieve recognition of Irish freedom. Far from it. Here's a letter written on May 17th. Quote, "Sir, the treaties now under discussion by the Conference of Paris will, presumably, be signed by the British plenipotentiaries claiming to act on behalf of Ireland as well as Great Britain. Therefore, we ask you to call the immediate attention of the Peace Conference to the warning which it is our duty to communicate, that the people of Ireland, through all its organic means of declaration, has repudiated and does now repudiate the claim of the British government to speak or act on behalf of Ireland, and consequently no treaty or agreement entered into by the representatives of the British government in virtue of that claim is or can be binding on the people of Ireland. The Irish people will scrupulously observe any treaty obligation to which they are legitimately committed, but the British delegates cannot commit Ireland. The only signatures by which the Irish nation will be bound are those of its own delegates, deliberately chosen. We request you to notify to the Peace Conference that we, the undersigned, have been appointed and authorised by the duly elected Government of Ireland to act on behalf of Ireland in the proceedings of the Conference and to enter into agreements and sign treaties on behalf of Ireland. Accept, sir, the assurance of our great esteem, Sean T. O'Kelly, George Gavin Duffy." Unquote. I might as well break it to you lads, Ireland was not going to get its independence using diplomacy. Thanks so much for watching. See you again soon. Thanks now. Good luck.